morning they buried Walter Voss, the rain came in sideways off the Delaware and didn't apologize for it. Not the soft, cinematic kind of rain that shows up in movies about grief. Not the kind that falls straight and quiet and gives a person room to feel something clean and complete. This was November rain in eastern Pennsylvania, mean and cold, and completely indifferent to the occasion. The kind that soaks through a wool coat before you finish the thought that you should have worn something warmer. The kind that makes the ground at the edge of an open grave feel uncertain under your shoes. Eleanor Voss stood at that edge without an umbrella. She hadn't forgotten one. She had simply decided somewhere between the car and the cemetery gate that she wasn't going to perform the version of grief that required accessories. Her father had hated performance in all its forms. The least she could do was show up the way she actually was, which was wet and cold and holding something in her chest that was too complicated to have a name yet. Walter Voss had been 67 years old. He had built a company from a single leased office in Center City, Philadelphia, with 4 employees and a phone that rang more than it should have given. That almost no one knew who he was. Yet into something that employed close to 400 people across 3 locations and managed assets that had made him, by any conventional measure, a serious man. He had done this through a combination of intelligence and discipline, and a relentless, grinding refusal to accept that anything was impossible if you were willing to outwork everyone else in the room. He had done this at the cost of things he never tallied because he didn't believe in tallying costs. He believed in forward motion. He believed in results. He believed in the ledger, and the ledger, as far as Walter Voss was concerned, did not have a column for what the building of a thing takes out of the people who love you. Eleanor was 38 years old. She was Walter's daughter, which had meant something specific and not entirely comfortable her whole life. And she was standing at his grave in the sideways rain, trying to locate the grief she knew was somewhere inside her, underneath the other things that were also there. Preston arrived 20 minutes late. She heard him before she saw him. The crunch of dress shoes on wet gravel. The particular rhythm of a man who has never in his adult life moved at anyone else's pace. She looked up, and there he was, 42 years old, and impeccable, a charcoal suit that cost more than some people's monthly rent, an umbrella held at precisely the right angle, not fully over himself, just enough to signal consideration without actually being inconvenienced by the rain. He took his position on the opposite side of the grave without making eye contact with her. That had been the arrangement for almost 3 years. Not a formal agreement. Just the natural consequence of 2 people who had stopped pretending they were something they weren't. Miriam stood between them the way she always had. Small and contained and carrying weight that had nothing to do with the black coat she wore. She had been married to Walter for 11 years. She had learned early in that marriage that survival in proximity to Walter Voss required a specific kind of grace, the grace of making yourself smaller. When the pressure increased of absorbing tension, the way good material absorbs stress, without breaking, without showing the strain. She was 68 years old, and she had practiced that grace so long it had become something close to architecture. She reached for Eleanor's hand under the shared shelter of no umbrella, because Eleanor had none. Eleanor let her take it. The priest said words that were true in the general way that words at grave sites are true. The rain said other things. Eleanor thought about the last real conversation she had with her father. Not the phone calls about quarterly numbers. Not the brief functional exchanges in the hallway of Voss Capital Partners when she was coming in, and he was going out and there was always somewhere else to be. The last real one, 8 months before he died. His office on the 14th floor of the building on Chestnut Street. The one with the window that looked out toward the river on clear days. Though that afternoon the sky had been the same flat gray it was now. He had called her in. Not unusual. He called people in all the time. She had sat across from him in the chair that faced his desk and waited. Which was what you did with Walter Voss. You waited for him to arrange his thoughts into the form he wanted them to take. He had looked at her for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You stayed." 2 words. That was the whole of it. You stayed. She had said, "Of course I stayed." And he had nodded once slowly and looked out the window. And then after a pause long enough to hold a different conversation inside, he had said, "Your brother has different priorities." She had not responded to that. She had not been willing to walk into that particular hallway with him, because she knew where it led, and she had spent years learning not to go there. And then, before she had fully processed what was happening, he had said something that stopped every other thought she was having. He said, "I've made mistakes. Dorian Voss Walter. A man who did not have that vocabulary. A man who had the vocabulary of adjustments and strategic recalibrations and lessons learned in the context of forward motion. Not mistakes. Never mistakes. And yet, there it was, quietly said to the window, rather than to her face. Said the way a man says a thing that has cost him something significant to arrive at. He didn't specify which ones. 2 minutes later, he was back to the quarterly figures and the moment sealed itself shut like water closing over a stone. And she had carried those 2 words and everything they might have meant for the 8 months. Between that afternoon and the morning she was standing at his grave in the rain. She thought about them now. Preston's umbrella caught a gust and tilted. He corrected it without expression. The priest finished. People moved. The kind of careful, quiet dispersal that happens when a room that wasn't a room empties out and everyone goes back to the business of being alive. Eleanor stood a moment longer than was strictly necessary. She was not sure what she was waiting for. She was not sure she was waiting for anything. Sometimes you just need an extra few seconds at the edge of something before you can turn around and walk away from it. She turned around and walked away from it. The call from Gerald Ashworth's office came the following morning. Gerald was 63 years old and had practiced estate law for over 35 years, the last 14 of them exclusively with Walter Voss. He was a careful man, precise. The kind of man who understood that every word in a legal document existed for a reason, and that reason had a consequence, and the consequence extended outward into people's actual lives in ways that demanded respect. His office was on the 14th floor of a building 6 blocks from the one where Walter had worked. Different building. Same altitude. Eleanor noticed that. The reading was scheduled for 3 days after the funeral. She dressed simply. Dark blouse, dark trousers, flat shoes. No jewelry except the small silver earrings she wore most days. She was not performing anything. She was just trying to get through it. She arrived at Gerald's building at 8:50 and took the elevator to the 14th floor and walked down the carpeted hallway to the conference room and sat down. The room smelled like leather and old paper. There was art on the walls that was expensive and not personal. The kind of art that has been chosen to fill space with quality rather than meaning. Preston was already there. He had not bothered to adjust his presentation for the occasion. Another suit. This one charcoal with a pocket square the color of winter wheat. He looked like a man arriving for a victory lap. He looked like a man who had already written the ending of this story and was now simply present for the formality of having it read aloud. Naomi, he said. It was the name he'd known her by before she'd quietly, without announcement, started going by her middle name in her professional life. It was the name he used when he wanted to remind her of something. Present, it said. Necessary. Furniture. Eleanor, she said, and sat down 2 chairs away from him. Miriam came in a few minutes later and took the seat between them. She looked like she hadn't slept since the funeral, which Eleanor suspected was accurate. She folded her hands around a small clutch purse and looked at the table, and didn't say anything. Gerald came in at 9 precisely. He set a thick file on the table, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and looked at each of them in turn before he spoke. That brief survey of the room, taking stock. "Thank you for being here," he said. "I'll proceed directly to the terms of the estate as Mr. Voss requested." Preston leaned forward almost imperceptibly, just a degree, just enough to signal readiness. The early sections were what Eleanor had expected. Charitable endowments to 3 foundations Walter had supported for years. Staff provisions specifically structured. The house in Vermont left in trust for maintenance rather than personal ownership, which surprised her slightly, and appeared to not register with Preston at all. He was nodding along with the rhythm of the sentences without processing their content, waiting for the part with his name next to the numbers. Voss Capital Partners. Gerald began had been built over 40 years. Preston straightened. The primary estate, Gerald continued adjusting his glasses in a way that was itself a kind of preparation, including financial assets, property portfolios, and controlling interest in Voss Capital Partners is to be distributed according to the following conditions. The word landed differently than the other words had. Conditions. Something shifted in the room. Even Preston heard it. Eleanor watched the faint tightening around his eyes, that microscopic adjustment of a man recalibrating in real time. "These are binding terms," Gerald said, "reviewed by independent legal counsel and executed in full accordance with applicable law. They are not suggestions." Preston smiled. The reconstructed smile, the one assembled piece by piece from practice and habit. "Of course. Let's hear them." The first condition was the kiln. Every existing dispute formally and permanently settled. No ongoing litigation, no pending claims, no challenges to asset transfers made within the last 5 years. Preston nodded immediately. Fine. He accepted all of it. Eleanor said quietly, "We haven't read everything yet." He didn't look at her. "It's fine. I've already reviewed the structure of the estate with Father's previous counsel. There's nothing significant that changes anything." Gerald looked at him for a moment. An unreadable look. "I would recommend each party take time to review the full documentation before signing." "I don't need time," Preston said. "I'm ready to proceed." And there it was. That absolute bone-deep certainty, the fundamental confidence of a man who had decided years ago that the world was arranged in his favor, and had found enough evidence for that belief along the way that it had calcified into something that felt like fact. Miriam said quietly, "Perhaps we should listen first." Preston looked at her. It wasn't cruelty exactly. Cruelty at least implies the other person matters enough to hurt. This was something more efficient than cruelty. She is here because Father wanted her here, he said. Not unkindly, the way you'd say something obvious to someone who needed it. Explained. But the operational decisions of this estate don't really fall within her. She is a named party in this will, Gerald said. His voice had not changed volume, but something in the room went very still. All three of you are named parties, Gerald continued in different capacities, which is why I'd ask that we proceed together, and that everyone listens to the full reading before any signatures are discussed. Preston set his phone down on the table without looking at it and said, "Fine, continue." The second condition was where the ground began to shift. Walter had stipulated that any heir claiming immediate access to the primary estate must demonstrate through documentation and third-party verification. Not simply state, but demonstrate that their involvement in the company over the preceding 5 years had been conducted with full transparency and in alignment with the company's stated fiduciary responsibilities. Preston's smile didn't disappear. It became something slightly different. A fraction tighter. A fraction more deliberate. "That's a standard due diligence clause," he said. "It is more specific than a standard clause," Gerald said carefully. "How specific?" Mr. Voss requested an independent audit of all significant transactions involving company assets over the past 5 years, to be completed before the estate is released to any primary heir. The room had a texture to its silence now. "An audit," Preston said. "Already initiated," Gerald said. "Per your father's instructions, the process began 60 days prior to his death." Eleanor watched Preston's face. He was exceptional at controlling it. He had been practicing since childhood. She had watched him do it. Watched him learn the trick of letting nothing show when everything was moving underneath. But something crossed his face in that moment that all his practice couldn't quite suppress. Not panic. Not yet. More like the sensation of ground shifting underfoot. Just slightly. Just enough. 60 days, he said. Yes, he was already. Preston stopped himself, restarted, folded his hands on the table. Why wasn't I informed of this? Because Gerald said the terms of the directive specified that it be conducted without the foreknowledge of the parties under review. A silence. Parties under review. Preston said slowly, "Yes." Preston looked at Eleanor. For the first time in 3 years, he actually looked at her. Not through her. Not past her. At her. And there was a question in his eyes. Specific, unguarded, the question of a man who has just felt the floor move and needs to know if the person across from him felt it too. Eleanor held his gaze and said nothing. Preston recovered. He was good at that. "An audit is fine," he said. "I welcome it." He paused and then reassembled the smile piece by piece until it was back in position. "An audit will in fact make it perfectly clear exactly how much I've contributed to the growth of this company over the past 5 years. That may be the case," Gerald said in a tone that was itself a kind of information. "So the estate is suspended pending the audit," Preston said. The estate is under conditional hold pending review of the final directive. Preston frowned. Final directive. That's different from the audit. Yes, Gerald said. They are separate items. He reached into the thick file and removed a sealed envelope. It was standard legal size. White. Sealed with a wax stamp, functional rather than decorative. Just closed. On the front, in Walter Voss's handwriting, that precise angular hand that Eleanor had known her entire life, were the words, Final Directive. To be opened at reading. Preston stared at it. Eleanor stared at it. Miriam made a small sound beside her, barely a breath, and pressed her hand flat on the table. This, Gerald said, was delivered to this office by your father personally, 8 weeks before his death. He requested that it not be referenced in any preliminary communications, and that it be presented only at the formal reading in the presence of all named parties. Preston's voice came out slightly thinner than usual. What is it? Gerald reached for the envelope and broke the seal. What we're about to find out, he said. Before Gerald read the first line, Eleanor understood something. Not the specific contents, not the details, but the architecture of it. Her father had been a builder. Everything he had ever done, he had built. Systems, structures, strategies, things designed to last, things that could bear weight over time without failing. And she understood, sitting in that conference room with the wax seal broken and the paper unfolding in Gerald's careful hands, that what she was about to hear was not improvised. It was not reactive. It was not the product of a dying man's bitterness or a final burst of grievance. It was something that had been built. Gerald read. The first section was a summary of findings from an internal investigation conducted over a period of nearly 2 years. Quietly. Through an independent channel. Through a forensic accounting firm that Walter had engaged privately without using the company's existing legal infrastructure, without involving any member of the existing board, without telling a single person who might have reason to interfere. The investigation had been centered on anomalies, patterns in the financial records, asset transfers structured over time to appear routine. They were not routine. As Gerald read the details, Eleanor found herself gripping the edge of the conference table, not from shock, not entirely, but from the specific nauseating sensation of hearing something confirm that she had always almost known, but could never prove, could never even fully articulate to herself. Because articulating it would have required her to say out loud that her brother was doing something to their father's company that her father either couldn't see or didn't want to see. Transfers routed through a subsidiary that Preston had established quietly using his signatory authority as COO. Transfers that had reduced the value of the company's operations division by approximately 17% over a 4-year period. A division that had subsequently been targeted for external acquisition by a firm in which Preston held a private, undisclosed interest. The acquisition would have allowed Preston to effectively purchase a portion of his own father's company at a deflated price he had personally engineered using value he had personally extracted. The room got very small. Preston was absolutely still. Gerald continued reading. In addition to the financial records, the directive contained a series of letters. Personal letters from Walter to Gerald written over the preceding 2 years. Not accusations. Documentation. observations, dates, times, decisions, conversations. Walter writing down what he saw in his careful angular hand, the way an architect documents the measurements of a structure he's about to take apart. He had known. He had known for years. And he had said nothing to Preston, nothing to Eleanor. Just watched and documented and waited and finally built a legal instrument so precise and so patient that it could undo in a single afternoon in a conference room on the 14th floor everything that Preston had spent years constructing. This, Preston's voice returned to him slowly, like a man finding something he'd dropped in the dark. This. There are inaccuracies in this document, significant ones. I want to be very clear about that. You'll have the opportunity to respond through proper legal channels, Gerald said. I'm responding now. Preston's voice was sharper. The control was starting to cost more than he had to spend. My father was in declining health. His judgment in the final months was. The directive was executed 8 weeks prior to his death, Gerald said. At that time, your father was assessed as being of sound mind and judgment by 3 independent evaluators. That assessment is part of the record. Preston looked at Eleanor. Whatever he saw on her face wasn't what he needed. Naomi, he said. He said her name differently now. Not furniture. Something else. You knew about this. I didn't, she said. You had to. You've been in his ear for months. I know you have. The whole time I was trying to grow this company, you were in there, working on him, turning him against me. Eleanor's voice was quiet. Stop. He's gone. Something broke open in Preston's voice then. Not grief. Something harder and uglier than grief. He's gone, and now you're gonna sit there and pretend this isn't exactly what you wanted. That this entire performance wasn't designed to. Preston, Miriam said, barely above a whisper. He stopped. She hadn't looked up from the table. Her hands were still flat against the surface, but her voice had something in it that none of them were used to hearing. Something final. He knew, she said. Your father knew. And he chose to do this. Not Eleanor. Not me. Him. Whatever you do with that is your business. But don't sit in this room and turn it into something it isn't. Silence. Preston looked at his stepmother for a long moment, and for just a fraction of a second so brief, Eleanor almost missed it. She saw his expression shift into something almost unrecognizable. Something like a boy who had just been told a truth he wasn't ready for. Then it was gone. Gerald completed the reading of the directive. The inheritance was suspended pending the outcome of the audit and any resulting legal proceedings. Preston's operational access to Voss Capital Partners was placed under immediate review by the board. And then Gerald looked up from the document, looked directly at Eleanor, and read the final paragraph. She recognized the rhythm of her father's sentences even through the filter of Gerald's careful delivery. The architecture of how he thought. He had written that the ultimate distribution of the estate in the event of findings consistent with what the directive described would be. Determined not by birth order, not by gender, not by who had been louder or more aggressive or more present in the formal meetings, but by who had actually served the company, who had protected the people who depended on it, who had stayed when staying was hard, and done the work when the work was invisible, and held things together not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. He had written, and Eleanor was not going to pretend she didn't feel this in every part of her body. He had written, Eleanor has always known what this company was for. I was too proud to tell her that while I still could. This is the only way I know how to say it now. She pressed her hand to her mouth. She did not cry. Not there. Not in that room with the leather chairs and the controlled quiet, and Preston sitting 3 feet away going absolutely still. But she felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel. Something that had been sealed shut for so long, she'd forgotten it was there. Not triumph. Not vindication. Relief. Clean, devastating, long overdue relief. Like a weight she hadn't known she'd been carrying had finally been set down. Preston left without speaking to her. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button and stood with his back to the room. He didn't look back. The doors opened. He stepped in. They closed. Miriam and Eleanor stood in the hallway afterward. Miriam looked smaller than usual. The formality she usually carried as armor had been set aside somewhere during the last 2 hours. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked. Miriam let out a long breath. "I've been waiting for this for a long time," she said. "Not exactly like this. Not this precise shape. But for something. For it to stop just sitting there, under everything." She straightened then. Eleanor could see her put the armor back on piece by piece, the way you pick up things you've had to set down to get through a narrow doorway. "I'm glad you were here today," Miriam said. "I'm glad you were too," Eleanor said. Miriam reached out and briefly, lightly touched Eleanor's arm. Then she was gone. Eleanor stood alone in the hallway for another minute. The carpet was very quiet under her feet. The art on the walls was expensive and impersonal. Outside the window at the end of the hall, the rain had stopped. The city below was that particular shade of gray-silver that only appears right after bad weather. Clean. Raw. More honest than the sky it usually shows. Her father had watched her work for 2 years without telling her he saw. He had built something intricate and patient. Not out of cruelty. Not entirely, but out of a combination of pride and love. And the inability to say the simple things while he was still breathing. He had made mistakes. He had told her so himself, in that careful, minimal way of his 8 months before he died. This was his attempt at a correction. It was not perfect. None of it was perfect. The years she had spent feeling invisible in this family were not going to be undone by a sealed envelope in a law office. But her father had seen her. Finally, imperfectly, far too late. He had seen her. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button, and stepped in when the doors opened and rode down 14 floors. In the ordinary, complicated, uncertain silence of a woman who had just had her entire understanding of her family rearranged and was now going back to the world to figure out what to do with that. Eleanor drove home, made tea, sat at her kitchen table in the dark without turning any lights on. She thought about her father. Not the father of documents and directives and 40 years of accumulated financial architecture. The other one. The one she caught glimpses of rarely, briefly, in the spaces between his armor. The one who had said, "I've made mistakes," in a voice that cost him something, and then looked out the window and then gone back to the quarterly figures as if the moment hadn't happened at all. She wondered if he had known in that moment how much she needed him to say more. Probably not. That was the thing about Walter Voss. He was extraordinary at building systems and terrible at understanding what the people inside those systems actually needed from him. He could engineer a legal instrument precise enough to dismantle his son's deception from beyond the grave. He could not, while living, tell his daughter that he saw her. She did not say that to be cruel to his memory. She said it because it was true. And the truth, even when it was uneven and uncomfortable, was the only thing she knew how to work with. The call from Conrad Hale came the following morning at 7:40. Conrad was 62 years old. He had been chairman of the Voss Capital Partners Board of Directors for 11 years, which meant he had known Walter almost as long as Miriam had, and in some ways had understood him differently. He was a compact man, direct, the kind of man who had never once in all the years Eleanor had known him wasted a sentence. "Come in," he said when she picked up. "Not a request." "I know," she said. When 8 o'clock. She was there at 7:50. The Voss Capital Partners offices occupied 3 floors of a building 12 blocks from Gerald Ashworth's. Eleanor had walked those halls more times than she could count. First as Walter Voss's daughter, which meant something specific and not entirely comfortable, and later as a director in operations, which meant something different and cost considerably more. The building felt different that morning. Or maybe she was different, and the building was reflecting it back at her. The receptionist looked at her with an expression she was clearly trying to control. Something caught between sympathy and careful blankness. "Good morning, Miss Voss." "Morning," Eleanor said, and took the elevator up. Conrad's office was on the top floor. Corner position. Windows on 2 sides. On a clear day, the view extended far enough to briefly alter your sense of scale. That morning, the sky was overcast. Everything outside the glass looked gray and close. Conrad was already at his desk. He stood when she came in and gestured to the chairs across from him, then came around and sat beside her, rather than returning to his position behind the desk. That was information. Conrad Hale communicated a great deal through spatial arrangement. "I'm going to be direct with you," he said. "Please." The board was informed yesterday of the contents of the final directive. Graham presented a summary. Not the full document, but enough. He paused. "We've also been briefed on the scope of the audit." Eleanor waited. "Some of us were aware that something was being investigated." Conrad continued. "Your father confided in me partially about 8 months ago. He did not tell me the full extent of what he'd found. He asked me to hold what he shared in confidence until the legal process was complete." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about Walter calling her into his office 8 months ago. The same 8 months. "You stayed," he had said. "Then I've made mistakes. Then the window." Apparently, her father had been having multiple kinds of honest conversations that autumn with different people in different rooms, parceling out the truth in portions he could manage. "What did he tell you?" she asked. "That he was concerned about the trajectory of certain decisions, about where things were heading." Conrad paused. "He also talked about you." That landed somewhere tender. "What did he say?" "He said you were the only one who had treated this company like it belonged to the people who worked in it." Conrad's expression didn't shift much. It rarely did, but something in his eyes was direct and serious in a way that felt like respect, rather than performance. He said that was rarer than it should be. Eleanor looked at the gray city outside the window for a moment. He never told me that, she said. No, Conrad said. He wouldn't have. 5 words. He wouldn't have. Not he didn't get the chance. Not he meant to. Just the plain, accurate truth of who Walter Voss had been, said by a man who had spent 11 years watching him from close range. What does the board need from me? Eleanor asked. Conrad leaned forward. Preston has already made contact through his attorney. He's disputing the directive. Diminished capacity, undue influence. He's throwing things at the wall to see what sticks. And his attorney, Raymond Driscoll, is skilled enough to make noise that sounds credible, even when it isn't. He'll challenge the audit, too. He already has. Formally, yesterday afternoon. Eleanor sat with that. Here's where we are, Conrad said. The company is in a stable position operationally thanks in no small part to the work you did in the operations division over the last 18 months. But the board cannot sit in neutral while a contested estate proceeding drags on. We need leadership that is functional and visible. She understood what he was saying before he finished. You want me to take an active role. I want you to take the role you were already doing, but with the authority that role actually requires. He paused. The board is prepared to appoint you as interim director of operations with expanded authority pending resolution of the estate. It's not the trustee position yet. That comes with the estate when it's settled. But it's not nothing. It was not nothing. It was considerably more than nothing. And Preston, she asked. Preston's operational access has been suspended pending the audit review. As of yesterday, he is not authorized to execute transactions, sign documents, or represent the company in any formal capacity. Eleanor thought about Preston at 26, walking into this building for the first time, in a suit that fit him perfectly, shaking every hand in the room, turning on a smile that worked on almost everyone. She thought about his face in Gerald Ashworth's conference room, the ground shifting, the practice failing. Okay, she said. Okay, you'll do it. Okay, I'll do it. Conrad nodded once. He picked up a folder from the table and held it out to her. You'll want to read through the operational briefings before Monday. There are things that need attention. Things that weren't being attended to the way they should have been. She took the folder. She knew what he meant. She knew there would be things in there. Small decisions redirected resources. Quiet erosions that bore Preston's fingerprints. Things that hadn't seemed significant in isolation, but would form a pattern once you laid them out together. Her father had seen that pattern forming. He'd been watching it for years. And instead of confronting it while he still had time, instead of sitting his son down and saying, I see what you're doing and it ends now, he had documented it. Patient, meticulous, exhaustive documentation. Then sealed it and handed it to his attorney and walked away and eventually died. She did not know if that was wisdom or avoidance. Maybe it was both at once. Maybe it didn't matter. The audit report landed on a Tuesday at 11:47 in the morning. She was in a meeting with 2 members of the operations team reviewing vendor contracts. The kind of unglamorous, necessary work that keeps a company functional. and that nobody at the executive level ever wanted to deal with. When Conrad's assistant knocked on the glass door and held up one finger, she excused herself and walked into the hallway. Conrad was already there, holding a bound document that was thicker than she had expected. He handed it to her without preamble. "Read the executive summary first," he said. "Then we'll talk." The executive summary was 6 pages. By page 3, she had to stop and put the document down on the windowsill and breathe. Not because the findings were surprising. She had expected something significant. But seeing it documented, quantified, sourced, laid out in the precise, affect-less language of forensic accounting was different from understanding it in the abstract. It was the difference between knowing a structure has been compromised and standing inside it while someone shows you exactly which load-bearing walls have been hollowed out. 31 separate transactions over a 47-month period. Total value extracted just under $4 million. Moved through 3 subsidiary structures, 2 of which had been established specifically to obscure the trail. The target division operations and infrastructure. The division she had spent 18 months stabilizing without knowing why it kept bleeding, had been systematically undervalued through a combination of deferred maintenance accounting and manipulated performance metrics. The external acquisition firm that had been positioned to purchase the division, the one in which Preston held an undisclosed interest, had submitted a preliminary offer 6 weeks before Walter died. Walter had declined it personally. He had been sitting on the full knowledge of what Preston had done, watching his son position himself to profit from the destruction. And he had quietly, without explanation or confrontation, blocked the acquisition. And then he had gone home and written it all down. Eleanor stood at that window for longer than she should have. Somewhere in the building below her, close to 400 people were doing their jobs, answering emails, making decisions, building things completely unaware that the ground they were standing on had been compromised, and that the person who had compromised it was still, as of that morning, filing legal challenges to the instrument designed to protect them. Conrad gave her time. That was one of the things about Conrad Hale. He understood the value of letting people absorb things before asking them to respond. When she came back to him, she said, "What happens now?" "The report goes to the estate attorneys and the board." He said, "Gerald Ashworth gets a full copy today. The legal proceedings around the directive will incorporate these findings. Raymond Driscoll's challenge becomes significantly harder to maintain in the face of this level of documentation." Significantly harder, she repeated, not impossible. Estate litigation is never technically impossible, Conrad said, with the plain honesty of a man who had been in business long enough to know that money and a skilled attorney could keep almost anything alive longer than it deserved. "But the challenge rests on arguing that your father was not of sound mind or was acting under someone's influence. This audit demonstrates a 2-year investigative process of extraordinary precision. That's not the work of a compromised mind." He was right. She knew he was right. But knowing something was right and having it feel settled were still different things. Nothing about any of this felt settled. The text from Preston came that same afternoon. Not through Raymond Driscoll. His name directly on her screen. She looked at it for 3 rings. Then she answered. "I assume you've seen the audit report," she said before he could speak. A silence. "Philip sent me a summary." "Then you know." Another silence. Longer. Naomi. Her voice came out harder than she intended, not shouting, just hard the way something goes when it has been soft for too long and has finally stopped accommodating. Don't start with that name like it's a negotiation opener. You filed papers 4 days after we sat across from each other. Your attorney filed a document suggesting I manipulated our father. That's what undue influence means in estate law, and you know it. That's not what the filing says. That is exactly what the filing says. She kept her voice level. I want you to tell me what you were hoping I'd say right now. The silence on his end was different from his other silences. Not calculating, not performing patience, just quiet. Philip advised me the challenge was necessary to protect my legal position. He said, finally. Philip is paid to protect your legal position, Eleanor said. He's not paid to protect your future or this company or anything that will matter to you 10 years from now. Those are different things. A pause. You sound like him, Preston said. She didn't have to ask who he meant. It stopped her. Not because it was flattering. She wasn't sure it was meant to be. But it was the first time in her memory that Preston had compared her to their father in a way that wasn't dismissive. The first time it had sounded like something other than a weapon. Maybe she said, he wasn't always wrong. The board is meeting on Friday, she continued, to review the findings and determine next steps. If you're going to make any decisions about Driscoll's strategy, you need to make them before then. Because after Friday, the shape of this changes. How? Once the board formally incorporates the audit into the estate record, your father's position becomes part of the legal foundation everything else is built on. Right now, there's still some ambiguity in the procedural timeline. There won't be after Friday. She did not know exactly why she told him that. It was not strategic, not in any way that benefited her. It might have been residue from something she hadn't fully processed yet about the kind of person she wanted to be in this situation. It might have been the part of her that understood somewhere below strategy and calculation, that closing every door entirely was its own kind of damage. Or it might have been something her father would have done, leaving a window open even when the door had been shut. I'll talk to Philip, Preston said. I'm not promising anything. I'm not asking you to, she said. I'm telling you where the timeline is. What you do with it is your decision. She hung up. Her hands were not entirely steady when she set the phone down. The Quan Cafe had been Preston's suggestion. He called 2 days before the Friday board meeting, directly, no attorney on the line, and asked if they could meet somewhere that wasn't an office and wasn't a conference room and wasn't anywhere, but either of them had history. She picked a place on the east side of the city. Ordinary, no associations. The kind of place with paper cups and mismatched chairs, and absolutely nothing to say about itself. He was already there when she arrived. That surprised her. Preston had been late to their father's funeral. He was not historically a man who waited. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping. She had seen him look bad before, briefly, in moments he couldn't control, before he reassembled. But this was different. This was the look of someone who had been alone with the truth of himself for several days straight, and hadn't yet found a way to make peace with it. I'm not going to apologize, he said when she sat down. If that's what you're waiting for. I'm not waiting for anything, she said. Philip thinks I have a real case. Ethan. She kept her voice level. 3 independent evaluators, 2 years of documented investigation. a forensic audit confirming every claim the Directive makes. You're going to spend a lot of money fighting something that is extremely well constructed by a man who spent 40 years building things that were hard to undo. And at the end of it, you're not going to win. He looked at his coffee cup, wrapped both hands around it. Didn't drink. He built a trap, he said. Not accusing, just stating. He built accountability, Eleanor said. There's a difference. He could have come to me. Something shifted in Preston's voice. Something underneath the control raw and unprocessed. If he'd been watching all that time, he could have said something. He could have sat me down and told me what he found and given me a chance to. He stopped. She waited. To what she asked carefully. He didn't answer, which was in its way an answer. Because what was the end of that sentence? Given me a chance to explain it away. Construct a better cover. Use the relationship to make him doubt what he'd seen. Preston was smart enough to know how that sentence ended. He was just not quite ready to say it out loud. He loved you, Eleanor said, in the way he knew how. Preston made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He loved the idea of what he wanted me to be. That's different. And the thing was, the genuinely complicated thing was that he wasn't entirely wrong. Walter had loved the potential he saw in Preston, the reflection of himself in his son's aggression and ambition and refusal to back down. He had loved that image, and in doing so had given Preston enough rope. But that wasn't the whole truth either. He also saw what you actually were, Eleanor said. And he still. She paused. He didn't destroy you, Preston. He could have taken this to prosecutors. He could have gone public. He could have cut you out entirely with no provision, no path, nothing. He didn't do any of that. Preston looked up at her. There's a provision in the Directive, Eleanor said. Gerald would have told you if you'd stayed to hear the full reading. What provision? She held his gaze. There's a path, in the language of the Directive. If the audit findings result in voluntary restitution, not court-ordered voluntary, and if there's a demonstrated, documented period of accountability, the board has the authority to revisit the estate terms. Not everything, but something. The silence in that coffee shop was very full. The ordinary sounds of the room moved around the edges of it. Someone's order called. A door opened and let in a brief thread of cold air. He built that in, Preston said slowly. He built that in, she confirmed. Preston sat with that. Eleanor watched him sit with it. Why are you telling me this? He asked. She thought about it honestly before she answered. Because he was our father, she said. And whatever he was, whatever he got wrong, whatever damage he did by not being what either of us needed, he was trying at the end to leave us something better than what we had. The least I can do is not waste that. Preston looked at her for a long time. He was not the Preston from the conference room, not the one from the elevator lobby or any of the versions she'd been carrying of him for the last several years. He was something smaller and less certain and more real. He was just a person sitting across a table from his sister. I don't know how to do what you're describing, he said, and his voice for the first time she could remember had no performance in it at all. I know, she said. Neither did he. A long pause. "That's not comforting," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's not." 4 days later, Raymond Driscoll filed the formal undue influence challenge. Eleanor read it standing in Conrad's office, unable to make herself sit down. The language was careful and professional and pointed directly at her. She was the named influence. She was the person the filing implied had manipulated a dying man into constructing a directive that stripped his son of his rightful inheritance. She had sat across from that man 2 days ago. She had told him about the provision. She had explained the timeline and given him information that was not strictly hers to share, because some part of her believed the coffee shop conversation had been real. And then he had let his attorney file a document that called her a manipulator. She set the filing down on Conrad's desk and looked out the window at the overcast city and felt the particular exhaustion of someone who has been trying to hold something together from the inside, while someone else throws things at it from the outside. Conrad said carefully, "He's following his attorney's advice." "I know," she said. "It doesn't mean the conversation you had wasn't real." "I know that too," she said. "But knowing a thing and feeling it are different operations entirely." She went back to work, because that was what you did. Not because it felt heroic. Because 400 people had shown up that morning expecting the floor to hold, and the least she could do was make sure it did. The board meeting was on Friday. All 7 board members were present. Gerald Ashworth attended as legal representative of the estate. Conrad ran the meeting with his characteristic efficiency, moving through the agenda in order, keeping the temperature at a functional level, even when the content of what was being discussed wanted to push it higher. The audit findings were presented in full by the lead forensic accountant, a woman named Dr. Renata Marsh, precise and calm, with the unhurried authority of someone who had spent a career being the person in the room who had actually done the math. She answered questions without hedging. When a board member asked whether the findings were consistent with intentional misconduct rather than negligence or error, she said yes without qualification. The word intentional moved through that room the way cold air moves through a gap, finding every space, filling it completely. There was discussion about the legal challenge about its viability in the face of the audit record. Gerald was measured. Driscoll's argument rested on undermining the directive. The directive was now supported by 2 years of documented investigation, 3 independent mental competency assessments, and a forensic audit confirming the core of every claim it made. The challenge was not dead. These things were never technically dead. But it had become, in Gerald's words, extremely difficult to maintain credibly. Then Conrad said, "There has been a development this morning that the board should be aware of." He looked at Eleanor briefly. She looked back at him. "Preston Voss has notified his attorney that he is withdrawing the legal challenge to the directive," Conrad said. "Effective this morning." Gerald received formal notification at 9 o'clock. The room went quiet. Eleanor had not known this was coming. She wanted to be clear about that. Not because it changed the outcome, but because honesty about her own experience was the only thing that made any of this worth telling. She had told Preston about the Friday timeline. She had not known whether he would act on it. She had not allowed herself to expect it. And sitting in that boardroom hearing Conrad say those words, she felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. Not triumph, Not relief exactly, though relief was somewhere in there. Something closer to grief's quieter cousin. The feeling of a tension releasing that you've held so long. You'd started to believe it was a permanent part of your body's architecture. He's also submitted a letter, Gerald said. He reached into his file and removed a single page. To the board and to the estate. He's requested it be read into the record. Conrad nodded. Gerald read it. It was not a long letter. Preston was not whatever else. He was a man given to extended emotional prose. But it was honest. Genuinely, plainly, without construction or qualification, honest. He acknowledged the transactions. He did not soften them or contextualize them or bury them in clauses about circumstances and pressures. He stated that the audit findings were accurate. He stated that the conduct documented over the 47-month period had been intentional and had caused material harm to the company. He did not explain why. He did not construct a narrative of justification. He just said it was wrong and I knew it was wrong and I did it anyway. 6 sentences. That was all. By the time Gerald finished reading, the room was very still. Patricia Slade, a board member who had been with the company almost as long as Conrad, looked across the table at Eleanor and said quietly, "Your father would have." And then she stopped herself because she was a careful woman and understood that finishing that sentence was beyond what the moment called for. But Eleanor heard it anyway. Your father would have. Yes, she thought. He would have. Whatever complicated combination of grief and pride and regret and love that a man like Walter Voss would have assembled in response to his son, finally publicly telling the truth, Eleanor carried a version of it in that boardroom. Not his version. Hers. But something in the same family. After the meeting, Conrad pulled her aside in the hallway. "How are you doing?" he asked. It was such a simple question in the middle of all this. "I don't know yet," she said. He nodded like that was a completely acceptable answer. "The board wants to move forward with the estate resolution," he said. "Given the withdrawn challenge and the completed audit, the legal path is cleaner. Gerald estimates 6 to 8 weeks to formal settlement. The trustee appointment follows the estate settlement." He paused. "Naomi." He stopped. "Eleanor." He corrected himself. "I don't think you understand yet what your father built here." She looked at him. "You've been so focused on keeping this thing from falling apart that you haven't had a moment to actually look at what's going to be in your hands when this resolves. This company in the right hands, with the right leadership. And I want to be very clear that I am talking about you can do things your father never imagined. Not because he wasn't capable of imagining them, but because he spent so much energy protecting what he'd built that he never had enough left to think about what it could become." She stood with that settling over her. Not comfortable weight, the kind that means something is real. 6 to 8 weeks, she said. Give or take. "All right," she said. "Then I've got work to do." Conrad almost smiled. It was the closest he usually got. She walked back to her office, sat down at her desk, and opened the vendor contracts that had been sitting in the corner of her screen since Tuesday morning. And she went back to work. The formal estate settlement meeting was on a Wednesday, 7 weeks after the reading of the will. The same conference room, the same 14th floor. the same controlled quiet. But the arrangement of people had changed. Conrad attended along with 2 board members as observers. Gerald had a second attorney present, a young woman named Sandra Fielding who handled the technical estate documentation with efficient precision. Miriam was there. And Preston was there. He had arrived before Eleanor, which surprised her again. He was sitting at the table when she came in wearing a gray sweater instead of a suit. The first time she could remember seeing him in a meeting setting without the full armor of formal business dress. It made him look younger, also more tired. The 2 things together created an impression that was harder to be in the same room with than his usual polished certainty, because certainty was something you could hold yourself against. This was just a person. He looked up when she came in, nodded once. She nodded back and sat down. Miriam arrived 2 minutes later, sat beside Eleanor, and briefly under the table pressed her hand over Eleanor's. 1 second, then withdrew it and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Gerald. Gerald began. The formal settlement proceeded in the measured language of legal resolution, the withdrawn challenge, the incorporated audit, the verified mental competency documentation, and the chain of custody for the final directive. Sandra Fielding moved through the technical sections with quiet efficiency. Then Gerald reached the section on distribution. He looked at each of them before starting. That brief, deliberate survey. It felt different now from the first time. Less like assessment, more like acknowledgement. He began with Preston. Per the terms of the directive and the conditions activated by the audit findings, Preston's claim to the primary estate, the financial assets, the property portfolios, the controlling interest, was formally extinguished. Extinguished, a word that felt more final than it needed to. But estate law doesn't concern itself with emotional texture. Preston did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the table, looking at a fixed point somewhere between the document and the middle distance. His face was very still, not the performed stillness of 7 weeks ago in this same room. This was a person sitting with a consequence they had accepted, and the sitting was hard, and they were doing it anyway. The provision was read next, the path Walter had built in. Preston would receive no share of the primary estate. However, upon completion of a formal restitution process overseen by the board and independent legal counsel, and upon a demonstrated period of structured accountability, no less than 18 months with quarterly review, he would be eligible for consideration of a negotiated role within the company. Not a leadership position, not operational authority. A defined, supervised role in a division other than the ones he had previously managed, starting from the bottom. In Preston's case, starting from a place of having done damage that would take years to fully repair. Preston's jaw moved slightly when Gerald read the 18-month timeline. That was the only visible reaction. Then he went still again. Gerald turned to Miriam. The provision for Miriam was genuinely generous in the straightforward way the rest of the estate had not been. The Vermont property left to her outright. A financial arrangement providing her with security independent of any ongoing proceedings. And a personal letter from Walter produced in a separate sealed envelope handed to her directly to be read privately and not entered into the formal record. Miriam took the envelope with both hands. She held it in her lap for the remainder of the meeting without opening it, and Eleanor did not look at her face because some things deserve privacy even in rooms full of people. Then Gerald looked at Eleanor. She had known this was coming. She had known the outline of it from the directive, from Conrad's conversations with her over the preceding weeks, from the logic of everything her father had constructed. She had known it intellectually, the way you know the shape of something before you've actually touched it. Knowing and arriving are still different things. Gerald read the formal designation of primary heir and trustee, the financial assets, the controlling interest in Voss Capital Partners, the responsibility, and her father had used that word specifically, responsibility, not privilege, not reward, of carrying the family name and the company forward, her name. In her father's words delivered by his attorney in the 14th floor conference room where 7 weeks ago she had pressed her hand to her mouth and not cried. She did not cry now either, but she felt the full weight of it land, not as triumph, not as vindication, though those things were somewhere in the room too, as weight. Genuine, serious, going to be with her for a long time. Wait. After Gerald finished reading, Sandra Fielding moved through the signature process. Documents signed, witnessed, notarized. The legal machinery completing its final rotation and coming to rest. When it was over, Conrad stood and offered Eleanor his hand across the table. She shook it. He nodded, gathered his things, and left with the 2 board observers, quiet and efficient, and without ceremony the way he did everything. Gerald and Sandra began consolidating the documentation. The room started its process of becoming an ordinary conference room again. Eleanor became aware of Preston standing near the door. He was putting on his coat, the ordinary, slightly effortful business of getting ready to go back out into a world that had fundamentally rearranged itself. He looked up and caught her looking at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then he said, "Eleanor." Yeah. He was working towards something. She could see it. The effort of a person trying to say a thing they don't have a practiced language for. The letter, he said finally, that I wrote to the board. I know. I meant it, he said. I want you to know that. Not as a strategy. Not because Philip told me it was my best option. He paused. I meant it. I know, she said again. And she did. You could feel the difference between a strategic apology and an honest one. They had different weights. This was the honest kind. Preston nodded, put his hands in his coat pockets. 18 months is a long time, he said. Yes. I've never done anything that looked like what that provision describes. Supervised. Quarterly review. He said the words with careful neutrality, trying not to let the humiliation of them show too directly. I don't know if I can do it. You can, she said. Whether you will is a different question. He looked at her for a moment. That's something he would have said. Maybe she said. A silence between them. Not hostile, not warm. Just present. The silence of 2 people who share a history that is complicated and irreducible, and not going away standing at the first possible moment of something different without any guarantee of what that different thing will actually look like. I'll see you around, he said. You will, she said. He left. The door closed. The room went quiet. Miriam was still sitting at the table, the unopened envelope in her hands, turning it slowly. When the door closed, she looked up at Eleanor. Are you all right? She asked. Getting there, Eleanor said. Miriam nodded. She looked back at the envelope. "Do you want me to stay?" Eleanor asked. "While you read it." Miriam considered it, really weighed it. "No," she said gently, "but thank you." But Eleanor gathered her things, said goodbye to Gerald, who told her with the precisely calibrated warmth of a man who had spent 14 years watching her father from close range, that he thought the company was in good hands. She thanked him. She walked down the hallway to the elevator and pressed the button. And while she waited, something happened that she hadn't expected. Something small and entirely physical and completely beyond her control. Her hands started shaking, not dramatically, just a fine, sustained tremor. The kind your body produces when it has been holding something at high tension for a very long time. And the tension has finally released. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. This time she didn't count the floors. 3 months after the settlement, Diane Pruitt knocked on her office door. Diane was 54 years old and had worked in the company's facilities management division for 19 years. She had been there longer than most of the current senior staff, long enough to remember what the building had looked like before certain budgets had been quietly redirected. She knocked on the open door with the precision of someone who had been considering this visit for some time and had finally committed. "Miss Voss," she said, "do you have a few minutes?" "Come in," Eleanor said. And it's Eleanor. Diane sat across from her with the careful posture of someone unaccustomed to sitting across from the person at the top of the building. "I want to talk to you about the Morrison Avenue team," she said. The Morrison Avenue team was 11 people in facilities management, the work that kept a company's physical infrastructure functional, the kind nobody thought about until something broke. They had been operating for 2 years with equipment overdue for replacement, a budget that had been cut 3 times in the period covered by the audit, and a staffing level that required people to regularly cover roles that should have had additional hires. Eleanor knew this because it was in the audit report. What she didn't know was what it had felt like from the inside. Diane told her. Not dramatically, not with an agenda beyond the simple, direct agenda of someone who had watched people work too hard for too long with too little, and had finally found someone she thought might actually listen. She talked about equipment failures they had managed without reporting because reporting meant justifying costs that always got cut. About 2 people who had quietly left in the last year because they couldn't sustain the workload. Eleanor listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't take notes while Diane was talking. She didn't want her to feel like she was giving a presentation. She just listened the way she had wished more people had listened in this building for a long time. When Diane finished, she looked at Eleanor with the cautious expression of someone who has said a difficult thing and is waiting to find out what it costs. "How long have you been sitting on this?" Eleanor asked. "Sitting on what?" "All of it. How long have you been watching this happen and not saying anything?" Diane was quiet for a moment. Since about the time it became clear that saying something wasn't going to change anything. That landed somewhere specific and uncomfortable. "It's going to change something now," Eleanor said. "I want a full assessment of the Morrison Avenue team's equipment and staffing needs on my desk by the end of the month. Not a trimmed-down version. Not a version that preemptively accounts for what you think I'll approve. The actual number. What it actually takes." Diane looked at her for a moment like she was confirming she'd heard correctly. Then she stood. "Thank you for coming in," Eleanor said. Diane nodded once with the restrained dignity of someone who had been thanked too rarely and wasn't quite sure what to do with it. Then she left. Eleanor turned back to her desk and thought about her father, about the fact that this division, these 11 people, this quietly absorbed damage had been right here the whole time. In his building, under his name. And he had either not known or not looked closely enough or trusted the wrong people to look in his place. She could not undo that. She could not restore the 2 years of budget cuts or the people who had left or the equipment failures absorbed without complaint. But she could make the next decision correctly, and the one after that. That was the job. Not the dramatic resolution, not the vindication. Just the next correct decision, and the one after that, for as long as the responsibility was hers to carry. 4 months after the settlement, Preston started his structured accountability period. He had spent those 4 months in what Eleanor could only describe based on the limited contact they'd had as a genuine reckoning with himself. Not performed. Not the visible kind of self-improvement people undertake when they want credit for the process. Something quieter and less public. He had engaged a new attorney independent of Raymond Driscoll, someone who specialized in the restitution process the Directive had outlined. He had begun the complicated, methodical work of accounting for the extracted value and structuring repayment arrangements realistic to his actual remaining assets. The morning he was scheduled to start his supervised role in the company's facilities management division, not the Morrison Avenue team, a different group. One where his presence would not immediately create complications for people who had already been through enough. Eleanor arrived at the office early. She had a full morning regardless, but when the elevator opened at 7:52 and Preston walked into the building in a plain jacket and dark trousers, no pocket square, no performance of anything, just a person arriving for work, she happened to be crossing the lobby. They saw each other at the same time. He stopped. She stopped. Neither of them had planned for this moment, which meant neither of them had anything prepared, which meant what happened was just real. "First day," she said. "Yeah," he said. He looked at her steadily. He still looked tired. Possibly that wouldn't go away quickly. Possibly it shouldn't. "The team lead down there is a man named Callum Breck," she said. "He's been with the company for 12 years. He's direct, and he's fair, and he has no interest in anyone's last name. He's going to treat you like what you are right now, which is a new person who has to earn it. That's the right approach." Ethan nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "I know you know," she said. "I'm just saying it out loud. So we're both clear on what this is. We're clear," he said. A silence between them. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "I'm sorry." The same plainness he'd used in the letter. No performance, no qualification, just the words. "For the filing, for pointing it at you." She looked at him. The thing about a genuine apology, the thing that distinguished it from its strategic cousin, was that it didn't come with an implicit request for something in return. It just landed and sat there, not waiting, not angling, just present. "I know," she said. And then because honesty required it, it hurt. He nodded. He didn't try to soften that or explain it away. He just accepted it. "Okay," she said. "Go meet Callum." He adjusted the strap of the bag on his shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for the provision, for telling me about it. You didn't have to do that." "No," she agreed. "I didn't." He left toward the elevators. She stood in the lobby for a moment and then walked to her office and started her day. It was not a reconciliation. She wanted to be honest about that. Ethan and Eleanor did not become close after that morning in the lobby. They did not become the siblings they might have been in a different family with a different father and different circumstances. What they became was functional, careful, occasionally honest with each other in ways that felt new and cost something to maintain. He worked his 18 months. He completed the restitution process. He showed up for Callum Breck's team and did the work without complaint, and without, as far as she could tell, expecting anyone to notice who he used to be. At the end of the 18 months, the board reviewed his case per the Directive's provision. Eleanor recused herself from that vote. The board offered him a mid-level position in a different division, still supervised, still conditional, but a step forward. He took it. That had to be enough, because it was all any of them actually had. 6 months after the settlement, a package arrived at her office. No return address on the outer envelope. Her name written in handwriting she didn't immediately recognize. Neat, a little cramped. The handwriting of someone who didn't write by hand often and was concentrating on doing it clearly. Inside was a single item, a photograph. It was taken at the company's 25th anniversary event. She remembered the event vaguely. She had been around 15 at the time, brought along as a family appendage to a business occasion she hadn't fully understood. In the photograph, a long table company staff in the background. Event space somewhere in the city. In the foreground, her father, younger by more than 2 decades, in a dark suit, standing beside him looking up at something off camera. A girl of about 15 in a blue dress, Eleanor. Her father's hand was on her shoulder. She had no memory of that moment. No memory of him touching her like that. Easy. Natural. Unremarkable. The way parents touch children when they're not thinking about it, when it's just reflex, just presence. But there it was in the photograph. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, found this in his desk when we cleared the office. Thought you should have it. Miriam. And beneath it, in different handwriting, not Miriam's, in the precise angular hand she had known her entire life. A line that had apparently been written on the back of that photograph. Sometime before Walter died, or perhaps was transcribed from his letter. She was not entirely sure, but either way it read like something he had finally found the language for. I did not know how to love people the right way. I knew how to love the things I built. I'm sorry I could not tell the difference. Eleanor sat at her desk for a long time holding that photograph. The company moved around her. Phones and footsteps and the ordinary productive hum of a living organization. 400 people going about the business of the day, building things, solving things, showing up. Her father's hand on her shoulder. Neither of them looking at the camera. Neither of them performing anything. Just there together in an unremarkable moment at a company party more than 20 years ago when she was 15 and he was in his prime, and neither of them had any idea what the future was gonna cost. She set the photograph on her desk, propped against the small lamp in the corner where she could see it from where she sat. Then she opened her laptop and went back to work. The photograph stayed there, not as a shrine, not as a performance of sentiment for the people who came into her office, and they came in increasingly as the weeks after the settlement turned into a rhythm of actual leadership, rather than provisional survival. It stayed because every time she looked up from whatever she was working on, it reminded her of something she needed to keep remembering, that the story she had been telling herself about her father, the version where he was simply cold, simply absent, simply a man who had chosen his company over his children and his pride over his relationships, was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The photograph was the part that didn't fit that story. The unremarkable, unposed, completely unconscious hand on a 15-year-old girl's shoulder. He had loved her in the broken, insufficient, chronically unexpressed way of a man who had been built by hard circumstances into someone who treated softness as a liability. He had loved her and failed her simultaneously, and both of those things were real. And she was going to have to live with the complexity of that for the rest of her life. She had made her peace with it somewhere between the settlement meeting and the morning she opened the package from Miriam. Not a complete peace. She didn't think complete peace was actually available in situations like this, but a working peace, the kind that lets you function, lets you be present, lets you do the next thing without the weight of the unresolved past pulling every decision sideways. The company needed that from her. The 400 people who showed up every morning needed a leader who was actually there. So she was there. The last time she visited her father's grave, it was a clear morning in early spring. Not the kind of morning that makes you feel like the world is offering you something. Just a clear morning, cold still. The ground damp from the night before. She went alone. She didn't bring flowers. Her father had never understood flowers as a gesture, and she didn't want to bring something he would have considered unnecessary sentiment. She stood at the stone for a while without saying anything. There isn't a script for this. There isn't a right way to stand at your father's grave and make sense of everything he was and wasn't. Everything he gave you and took from you. Everything that got broken, and the imperfect, complicated ways it had been repaired. She didn't try to make sense of it. She just stood there. And after a while, she said out loud to the stone and the cold air, and nobody in particular, "I've got it from here." Not a promise, not a performance, just a statement. A simple, true statement from a person to the person who made her, acknowledging that the baton had been passed and the race was going to continue, and she was going to run it the best way she knew how, which is all any of us can do. The ground was damp under her feet. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. Behind her, somewhere in the distance, the city was already into its mourning, already moving, already building, already full of people doing the next necessary thing. She stayed a little while longer. Then she turned around and went back to work.